It was the kind of cold that could freeze your breath before it left your mouth. And in the mountains, survival was a game of inches. But for one settler, it wasn't just about surviving. He had discovered something that could change the way pioneers lived in the wilderness forever. His design would make cabins safer, stronger, and warmer than ever before. It started as a secret and ended up being a revolution. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories about the wild frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will take you deeper into the mountains than ever before. The winter of 1845 had arrived early, settling like a heavy hand on the snow-covered peaks of the Rocky Mountains. In a small cabin perched on the edge of a ridge, Samuel Terrence stood looking out over the frozen valley, his breath visible in the crisp, biting air. He was no stranger to the harsh winters of the frontier, but this one was different. The cold seeped into every bone of his body, and no matter how much he stoked the fire, no matter how thick the blankets were, the warmth never lasted long. The wind howled relentlessly through the gaps in his cabin's logs, sending a chill straight to his core. He had spent years perfecting his life in these mountains, years spent learning the ways of survival, of trapping and hunting. But he had never been able to escape one fact, the cold. It gnawed at his bones, and no matter how sturdy the cabin or how well he kept the fire stoked, it was never enough. Each winter was a reminder of how fragile life could be here. One misstep, one wrong turn in a snowstorm, and that could be the end. On this particular day, as the snow continued to fall in heavy, steady flakes, Samuel made a decision. He would not let the cold claim him again. The settlers around him had built cabins for generations using the same methods passed down from their ancestors. The notched logs, the moss and mud chinking between the cracks, these were the basic tools of their trade. They worked well enough to keep the wind at bay, but they were no match for the ferocity of the mountain storms. Samuel knew this. He had felt it firsthand, and now he was determined to change it. The idea came to him slowly, almost like a whisper in the back of his mind. What if there was a way to build a cabin that could withstand the cold more effectively? What if there was a way to use the land itself to tap into the natural elements of the mountain to create a structure that could stay warm even in the deepest winter? He had seen structures in nearby towns made from stone and iron, materials that held heat longer than wood. What if he could adapt those techniques, mix them with his own knowledge of the land, and build something that would stand strong against the storm? As the fire crackled in the hearth behind him, Samuel felt a surge of determination. He knew this would take time, months, perhaps even years. But it was a challenge he was willing to take on. He was going to build something different, something that could keep out the cold. And if it worked, it would change everything for the men and women who lived in the mountains. The next morning, Samuel set out to gather the materials he would need. His cabin was far from town, nestled in a secluded valley where few others dared to settle. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to survive without relying on others. But this project was different. He would need more than just the basic tools he had used for years. He would need iron, stone, and perhaps even something he had never used before, new building techniques. Samuel's first stop was a small settlement about 20 miles away. There he knew of a blacksmith who had the tools to shape the iron he would need for the frame. The journey was difficult, with deep snow making it hard to navigate, but he was used to the struggle. It was part of life in the mountains. He packed his rifle, provisions, and a notebook to jot down his ideas. The cold was already starting to bite at his face, but he was focused. When he arrived at the blacksmith shop, he explained his plan, a cabin that could withstand the weight of winter, one that would hold in the warmth long after the fire had gone out. The blacksmith raised an eyebrow at first, skeptical of the idea, but Samuel's persistence won him over. Together they forged iron brackets, pins, and nails, tools that could hold a structure together in ways traditional methods could not. With the iron supply secured, Samuel turned his attention to the next challenge, finding stone for the foundation. There was a quarry a few miles from his cabin, and although it would take hours to gather the necessary amount, he knew the value of a solid foundation. He spent the next 2 days hauling rocks, each one heavy and sharp, but he did not mind. The physical exertion was good for his mind. As he worked, he thought about the construction process, about how he could adapt what he had learned from years of living in the mountains and combine it with the principles he had seen in the stone buildings of the town. By the time Samuel returned to his cabin with the supplies, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. He was tired, but there was no turning back now. He had the materials he needed. Now it was time to put his plan into action. He stood at the site where his new cabin would be built and surveyed the land. The slope of the ridge would provide natural drainage, and the surrounding trees would offer protection from the worst of the wind. But it was the design of the cabin itself that would make all the difference. Samuel began by laying out the stones for the foundation, each one carefully placed, making sure they were level. It took time, but as the walls started to take shape, so did his vision. He was creating something that had never been done before, something that would keep out the cold and protect the settlers who would follow in his footsteps. The work was grueling, and the winter was growing colder by the day, but Samuel was driven. He knew that what he was building was not just a cabin, it was a lifeline for the men and women who would need shelter in the coming years. His design, though untested, had the potential to change everything. With the foundation in place, he moved on to the walls. He would not use the traditional methods of notching logs. Instead, he would create overlapping layers of stone and iron, a method he had seen in the old buildings of the town. It was an unorthodox choice, but Samuel was convinced it would work. The first layer of stone was carefully laid, and Samuel stepped back to admire his work. It was a simple start, but it was a start that could change the way people thought about survival in the mountains. With the foundation and walls in place, he would need to focus on the roof. But that was a task for tomorrow. For now, Samuel allowed himself a brief moment of rest before he returned to his work, knowing that the next few days would be just as challenging as the first. The days that followed were a blur of hard work and cold winds, but Samuel Tarrant was driven. He had begun the process of creating something new, something that would forever change the way cabins were built in the frontier. The materials were gathered, the foundation laid, but now it was time to shape his vision into reality. The Quonset-style cabin he had designed would be no ordinary shelter. Its rounded metal roof and stone foundation were a departure from tradition, but Samuel believed that if he could make it work, it would be a fortress against the cold. Samuel had spent years observing the way other cabins were built. He had seen many structures fail to stand up to the harsh winters, often because of weaknesses in their roofs, walls, and foundations. It was these failures that had driven him to search for something better. He had studied the stone structures in nearby towns, the way they used rounded arches and domed ceilings to trap heat and redistribute it. He had also spent months researching materials, metal, stone, and clay, that could help create a stronger, more insulated shelter. And now he was ready to put those ideas to the test. The first step in building his new cabin was assembling the metal frame. Using steel sheeting he had acquired from a nearby settlement, Samuel began to shape the rounded roof. He had never worked with metal in this way before, but his knowledge of carpentry and his determination drove him forward. Slowly, carefully, he bent the sheets into place, using metal rods to reinforce the structure and create a perfect arch. The process took longer than expected, but each step brought him closer to his goal. Once the roof was in place, Samuel began the next phase, building the walls. Rather than using the traditional notched logs, he decided to incorporate stone. The heavy, insulating qualities of stone would create a natural barrier against the freezing winds that often swept across the land. He built the stone walls methodically, layer by layer, ensuring that each stone fit perfectly. It was a slow process, but Samuel was used to working alone, and he was determined to see his vision realized. By the time the walls were halfway complete, Samuel was already feeling the benefits of his design. The walls, though heavy and time-consuming to build, were solid and secure. They would provide the protection he needed, not just from the cold, but from any potential predators or intruders. The metal roof, once completed, would trap the heat inside, creating a warm interior even during the coldest nights. As the days passed and the structure began to take shape, Samuel grew more confident in his design. He could already feel the difference in the air around him. The wind no longer howled through the cracks in the walls. The shelter felt sturdy, almost impenetrable. There were still many challenges to overcome, but for the first time since he began this project, Samuel felt a sense of hope. This cabin, though unconventional, might just be the answer to the mountain's cruelest winters. By the time Samuel had finished the basic structure of the cabin, the first snows of the season had begun to fall. Winter was officially upon him, and he knew that the real test was just beginning. The cabin had taken shape, but now it had to prove itself. Samuel had built it to withstand the cold and the elements, but until he spent a night inside, he couldn't know for sure whether his design would actually hold up. The wind howled across the mountains, and the temperature plummeted. Samuel's cabin, though still unfinished in some parts, was ready for its first trial. He gathered what little firewood he had, built a fire in the small hearth he had constructed, and settled inside. The stone walls immediately gave him a sense of security. They felt solid, anchored to the earth, and he could already feel the warmth radiating from the fire as it bounced off the thick walls. For the first time in his years on the frontier, Samuel felt truly warm inside his cabin. The wind rattled the metal roof above, but the shelter itself stood firm. He spent the night in the cabin, keeping the fire stoked and watching the snow pile up outside. The temperature dropped to nearly 30 degrees below zero, but inside the cabin it remained surprisingly warm. The stone walls held the heat from the fire, and the metal roof trapped it inside, preventing the heat from escaping. As the hours passed, Samuel continued to test the cabin's endurance. He moved around inside, checking the temperature in different corners of the room. He wanted to be sure that his design was as effective as he had hoped. He also noticed that the cabin was remarkably quiet. The wind outside might have been fierce, but inside he could hear nothing but the crackle of the fire. By morning, Samuel was exhausted, but relieved. His cabin had passed its first test. It had held its warmth through the night, and it had provided him with the shelter he so desperately needed. For the first time, he felt confident that his design was not just a dream, but a practical solution to the problems of mountain living. But Samuel knew that this was just the beginning. The cabin had withstood the cold, but there were still challenges ahead. The roof would need to be reinforced, and the walls required further insulation. But for now, as he watched the snow continue to fall outside, Samuel allowed himself a moment of triumph. He had built something that worked. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was the first step toward a new future in the mountains, one where survival was no longer a matter of mere luck, but of ingenuity and design. The coming days would bring new tests, new obstacles, but Samuel was ready. He had created something that could withstand the worst the wilderness could throw at it, and he was determined to perfect it. The mountains were unforgiving, but for the first time, Samuel felt as though he was not just surviving, but thriving. As the weeks passed, Samuel continued to refine his design. The first test of his cabin had been a success, but the winter was far from over. The winds were becoming fiercer, and the snowfalls were growing heavier. The true test of his shelter's resilience had yet to come. Samuel knew that the mountains were unpredictable, and no matter how solid the foundation, there would always be another challenge lurking on the horizon. His goal was not only to survive, but to make sure that his cabin could withstand any threat, be it the elements or the creatures that called this land home. It wasn't long before Samuel faced the next challenge. One late afternoon, as the sky began to darken with the impending storm, he spotted something that made his heart race. A massive grizzly bear was circling the outskirts of his property, drawn by the scent of his cabin's warmth. He had seen the tracks of such creatures in the snow before, but this one was particularly large. Its footprints were deeper and wider than any he had encountered. The bear had been circling the area for hours, testing the limits of the land around his cabin. Samuel had known that the metal roof and stone walls would provide protection against the cold, but he had designed the cabin to withstand more than just the elements. The mountain was full of predators, and Samuel had built this cabin with the intent that it could also stand up to them. As the bear grew bolder, walking closer to the cabin's perimeter, Samuel watched from his hidden vantage point inside. The metal roof was silent under the heavy snow, but the walls were rock solid. He had left narrow, discreet gun ports in the stone, which allowed him to view the wilderness without exposing himself to danger. The bear's heavy paws crunched in the snow, and it sniffed the air, searching for any sign of weakness. It tried the corners of the cabin first, just as Samuel had anticipated. It pressed out its massive claws against the stone, but the walls held strong. The bear roared in frustration, its breath clouding in the icy air, and then turned its attention to the door. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the animal assess his only entrance. The door was something Samuel had spent days perfecting, reinforced with heavy iron brackets and a unique locking mechanism. He knew that if a bear attacked, it would most likely target the door, thinking it the weakest part of the structure. But this door was different. The bear's claws scraped against the heavy wood, but the door did not budge. For what seemed like hours, the bear tested every inch of the cabin's defenses. It clawed at the stone, tried pushing against the walls, and even stood up on its hind legs to test the window, but nothing gave. The bear finally relented, exhausted and frustrated, and lumbered off into the wilderness. Samuel remained hidden inside, watching through the gun ports until the last trace of the animal disappeared. This was the moment Samuel had been waiting for. His design had passed its first real test. The cabin had held strong against the grizzly's attack, its innovative construction providing the safety and security he had hoped for. But he knew this wouldn't be the last time a creature would come testing his defenses. The wilderness was full of surprises, but for now, Samuel felt a rare sense of relief. His work was beginning to pay off. The winter continued its relentless march across the mountain, but Samuel felt a growing sense of pride in the shelter he had built. Word of his unusual cabin began to spread among the other settlers. In the small, scattered communities that dotted the region, Samuel's design was becoming a point of fascination. It wasn't just the size or the shape of the cabin that intrigued them, it was the construction. Settlers, trappers, and hunters alike had grown accustomed to the traditional log cabins, which could be built quickly and efficiently with minimal tools. But Samuel's design, with its stone walls and metal roof, was something entirely new. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a statement. The settlers had long been accustomed to struggling against the elements, but here was a man who had chosen to face the mountain head-on, to create something that could endure the harshest winters and the fiercest storms. At first, the visitors were skeptical. Some laughed at the idea of a cabin built from stone and metal, arguing that it was a waste of precious resources. They had built cabins in the traditional way for generations, and they didn't see the need for change. But Samuel, ever patient, explained his methods to those who were curious. He spoke of the lessons he had learned from the land, the way the stone could hold in the heat and the metal could shield against the wind. It wasn't long before a handful of men came to visit Samuel, eager to see the cabin for themselves. They were seasoned trappers, hardened by the years they had spent in the wilderness. They had survived more winters than they could count, but they had never seen anything like this before. They arrived one afternoon, their faces weathered from the elements, their clothes caked in snow. Samuel welcomed them inside, and as soon as they stepped over the threshold, the warmth of the cabin hit them. The fire in the hearth crackled, the stone walls radiating the heat. It was a stark contrast to the cold, biting winds outside. One of the men, a trapper named William Marshall, stepped over to the fire, rubbing his hands together. "I'll admit," he said, his voice gruff but impressed, "this is something different." Samuel smiled, watching the men closely. He had hoped for a reaction like this. William had been one of the men who had mocked his design when he had first started building it. But now, standing inside the cabin, he could see the admiration in his eyes. "What makes this different?" another trapper, a younger man named Jacob, asked as he looked around. "How does it hold the heat so well?" Samuel took a deep breath, feeling a surge of pride. "It's the way the materials work together," he explained. "The stone walls absorb the heat and release it slowly, while the metal roof traps it inside. It's a design based on necessity, not tradition." The men continued to inspect every inch of the cabin. They marveled at the reinforced door, the sturdy stone walls, and the thoughtful placement of the windows. As the evening wore on, they began to ask questions, eager to learn more about the techniques Samuel had used. Samuel in turn shared everything he had learned: the stone foundation, the metal roof, the reinforced door, and the clay chinking he had used between the logs. He explained how each element played a crucial role in keeping the cold out and the warmth in. By the end of the night, the men were sold. They left Samuel's cabin with a newfound respect for his design, promising to share what they had learned with others. Samuel's innovation, born out of necessity and the desire to survive, was beginning to take root. It wouldn't be long before his technique spread through the mountain communities, changing the way cabins were built forever. As winter deepened, Samuel's cabin became more than just a sanctuary from the cold. It became a symbol. Visitors continued to arrive, drawn by rumors of its revolutionary design. Some came out of curiosity, others out of necessity, and a few simply to learn from a man they considered both eccentric and determined. Samuel had built the cabin as a refuge, but now it was beginning to take on a new role, one of leadership and innovation. One particularly cold morning, as Samuel worked to reinforce the cabin's framework, a group of settlers from a nearby town arrived. They were a family of 4, husband, wife, and 2 young children, clad in heavy furs, their faces drawn tight against the wind. They had come seeking refuge from a harsh winter, hoping to find shelter before the worst of the storms hit. Their current cabin had been damaged during a particularly brutal snowstorm, leaving them exposed to the elements. Samuel welcomed them into his home without hesitation, offering them the warmth and safety that his cabin could provide. As the family settled in by the fire, they marveled at the warmth of the space, the steady heat radiating from the stone walls, and the comfort of the carefully constructed interior. Samuel, in turn, watched them carefully, sensing the weight of responsibility that had settled upon him. The family had heard of his cabin's design, but had yet to witness it firsthand. The wife, a woman named Anne, was particularly vocal about her astonishment. "I've never felt such warmth," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Not even in our own home, with the fire roaring in the hearth." Samuel smiled, watching the fire crackle and dance in the hearth. "It's all about how the materials work together," he explained. "The stone walls absorb the heat from the fire and release it slowly, while the metal roof traps the warmth inside. The design keeps the heat where it belongs, inside." As the night wore on, Samuel found himself reflecting on how much had changed since he first began his project. The cabin, which had started as a mere attempt to protect himself from the brutal cold, was now something much more. It had become a place of hope for those who had struggled to survive in the harshness of the frontier. But with this newfound purpose came a weight. Samuel knew that the innovations he had pioneered would require hard work and dedication to spread. Others would need to learn from his design, to adapt it to their own needs, and to carry it forward. This responsibility weighed heavily on him, but he also understood that it was a necessary part of the process. If his cabin was going to help others survive, he couldn't simply keep it to himself. By early spring, word of Samuel's cabin had spread far beyond the small mountain communities. Trappers, settlers, and even hunters from distant regions had begun arriving at his doorstep, eager to see the structure for themselves. Samuel had always been a solitary man, accustomed to the quiet of the mountains, but now his life was changing. He found himself guiding others through the design and construction of cabins, helping them understand the principles behind his innovation. One morning, a man named Thomas Hale, a settler from a nearby town, arrived with a small group of workers in tow. They were looking to build a new cabin for their family and had heard of Samuel's methods. "We've seen the damage the snow and storms have done to our homes," Thomas explained, his face weathered by years of hard living in the wilderness. "We need something that can withstand the cold, something that will keep us safe." Samuel nodded, his mind already turning over the details of the build. "I'll show you how it's done," he said, a quiet confidence in his voice. "But it won't be easy. It takes time and patience, and it's not something you can do quickly." The group set to work under Samuel's watchful eye. He explained each step of the process in detail, from the selection of the materials to the way the stones were to be laid for the foundation. He showed them how to bend the metal sheets to create the curved roof and how to layer the chinking between the logs for maximum insulation. Every detail mattered, and Samuel was determined to pass on his knowledge, ensuring that the cabins built with his design would last. The work was grueling, and the days stretched into weeks. The group encountered setbacks along the way, harsh weather, difficult terrain, and even a few mistakes in the construction process. But Samuel was patient, offering advice and guidance whenever it was needed. Slowly, the cabin began to take shape, and with it, a sense of accomplishment grew among the workers. By the time the cabin was finished, it stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together and committed themselves to something greater than themselves. The settlers were amazed at the results. The cabin was sturdy, warm, and designed to last. They knew that they now had a shelter that could withstand the worst the mountains could throw at it. As Samuel stood back, watching the final touches being added to the cabin, he felt a sense of pride welling up inside him. The legacy he had set out to build was taking root. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about ensuring that others could thrive in the unforgiving wilderness. Samuel had created something that went beyond mere shelter. He had built a solution, a design that could change the way settlers approached life on the frontier. He knew there was still much work to be done, many more cabins to build, many more lives to impact. But for the first time, Samuel felt a deep satisfaction. His work had meaning, and it would live on long after he was gone. With every cabin that rose from the ground, with every person who learned from his design, Samuel's legacy grew. He had not only survived the wilderness, he had found a way to make it a little more livable for everyone else. Spring in the mountains came slowly, the snow receding in uneven patches and leaving behind an earth softened by the late thaw. But the change that Samuel had brought with his innovative cabin design was no longer a small ripple. It was turning into a powerful wave. Word had spread further than he ever expected, reaching the ears of settlers, prospectors, and even military outposts. What had started as a desperate attempt to outsmart the cold had blossomed into a widespread movement. Samuel had unknowingly become a beacon of hope, a man who had solved a problem that everyone else had accepted as a simple part of frontier life. As the days grew warmer, Samuel found himself spending less time working on his own cabin and more time helping others. He had become a teacher of sorts, guiding those who came seeking his expertise. The work was hard, but the satisfaction of knowing that his design was helping others survive made the effort worthwhile. There were days when he felt overwhelmed by the number of people knocking on his door. But each visit, each conversation, reminded him of the importance of what he had done. One day a man named Caleb Thomas arrived, looking disheveled but determined. Caleb was a trapper who had spent years in the wild, but his cabin, built in the traditional way, had been nearly destroyed in a late-season snowstorm. "I've heard about your cabin," Caleb said, his eyes tired but filled with hope. "I've seen the way your design works. I need something that'll hold up to these damn storms. Can you help me?" Samuel didn't hesitate. "Of course. Let's get started," he said. Caleb's eyes lit up as they walked toward the construction site where Samuel had recently helped others build their cabins. The snow had started to melt, leaving behind patches of soggy earth, but Samuel was unfazed. They could work around it. Together, they spent the next several weeks laying the foundation, building the stone walls, and assembling the unique metal roof. Samuel showed Caleb the process, explaining how each piece worked together to create a structure that could resist the weight of the snow, the force of the wind, and the crushing cold. Caleb was a quick learner, and he marveled at the way the cabin seemed to come together almost effortlessly under Samuel's guidance. By the time the walls were up, Samuel could see the change in Caleb's demeanor. The man, once worn out and defeated by the constant struggle against the elements, was now energized. The cabin was taking shape, and with each new section, Caleb grew more confident. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fire, Samuel watched Caleb's tired but contented expression as he examined the progress they had made. The wind outside had picked up, the temperatures dropping again as the night began to set in. Inside the half-constructed cabin, however, the air was calm and warm, the fire crackling and the stone walls holding the heat in. This is it," Caleb said softly, almost to himself. "This is what I've needed all along. Thank you." Samuel nodded, his mind already moving toward the next task. He knew that Caleb's cabin would not be the last. With each new build, he was passing on something far more important than just a roof over someone's head. He was passing on a way of life. And in doing so, he had unknowingly become part of the very fabric of the frontier. His design was more than just a physical structure. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of adaptation. Summer brought new challenges to the mountains. The snow had fully melted, leaving behind soggy trails and difficult terrain, but the heat was starting to creep in. For Samuel, it was a season of reflection. The cabins he had helped build, the families he had helped settle, and the lives he had touched all weighed heavily on him. His mind had always been focused on survival, on getting by, on making it through another winter. But now, for the first time, he realized that his work had outgrown him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving, about changing the future of those who lived in the mountains. One evening, as he sat in front of his own cabin, the sun setting behind the peaks, Samuel saw a group of travelers approaching. At first he assumed they were another group of settlers looking for help. But as they drew closer, he recognized the leader, an old friend from his trapping days, a man named Elias Turner. Elias had been one of the first trappers Samuel had worked with when he first came to the mountains, and he had heard about Samuel's design through the grapevine. Elias approached with a weary smile. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, shaking Samuel's hand warmly. "Word of your cabins has spread far, even down to the towns by the river." Samuel nodded, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "I've been busy, Elias." "The work's been good, but it's a lot to keep up with." Elias looked at him seriously. "You've built something here, Samuel, something bigger than just a cabin. People are talking, they're seeing what you've done, and they're starting to realize that what you've created could change everything." Samuel stared at the cabin in front of him, his thoughts momentarily distant. It had started as a way to protect himself. Then it had become a solution for others. Now it was something far more profound. It was a legacy. "I never set out to create a legacy," Samuel said quietly, almost to himself. "I just wanted to survive." Elias laughed softly. "You've done more than survive, my friend. You've given people a way to build something that lasts, something that can stand the test of time." The words resonated with Samuel, and for the first time he allowed himself to fully appreciate what he had done. His cabin, with its metal roof and stone walls, had become more than just a shelter. It had become a foundation for future generations. "I guess I did," Samuel said, finally allowing himself a smile. "I've built more than just a cabin. I've built a way of life." As Elias and his group set up camp nearby, Samuel realized that his work was far from over. He had planted the seed of innovation, and now it was spreading like wildfire. The cabins were more than just structures. They were a testament to the resilience and creativity of the human spirit. Samuel had not only built something that could withstand the wilderness, he had created something that could endure for generations to come. And with that, Samuel Tarrant knew that his work, his legacy, was just beginning. By the fall of 1846, the first snows had begun to blanket the mountain slopes once more. Samuel Tarrant stood at the edge of his cabin, looking out at the vast, untouched wilderness. The sight, so familiar to him, always filled him with a sense of peace. But it was different now. The changes he had started were bigger than just his cabin, bigger than the work he had done. The frontier was evolving around him, and with it, Samuel's place in it was changing as well. The cabin he had built stood as a beacon, a symbol of a new way of life in the mountains. Word had spread beyond the small, remote settlements, and now even towns in the valley below had begun to adopt his design. The sturdy stone walls, the reinforced metal roof, and the meticulously crafted doors were now the talk of the region. More settlers arrived each year, eager to replicate what Samuel had done. The demand for his design was growing, and so was his reputation. But with this newfound recognition came a price. Samuel had always been a solitary man. He had built his cabin in isolation, drawn to the peace and quiet of the mountains. Now, with every visitor and every new cabin being built under his guidance, Samuel found himself torn between his work and his desire for solitude. He was no longer just a trapper and a settler. He was a teacher, a mentor, and to some, a hero. One afternoon, a group of men arrived at his doorstep. They were from the nearby town of Bitter Creek, a larger settlement that had recently grown rapidly. They were ambitious, driven by a need to expand their own homesteads, and they had heard of Samuel's success. "We need your help, Tarrant," said the leader of the group, a burly man named Garrett Lawson. "We've built cabins the old way, but the last storm nearly wiped out half the town. We need something better, something that can withstand the worst the mountains have to offer." Samuel listened, his mind racing. He knew the pressure that came with these requests. It wasn't just about building a cabin anymore. It was about transforming the way people lived. The demands were growing, and so were the expectations. The work had become more about helping others than about his own survival, and it was starting to feel like a burden. He glanced back at the cabin he had built years ago, the one that had started it all. It was still as solid as ever, the stone walls strong, the roof secure. But now, every time Samuel added to the growing network of cabins, he felt a little more disconnected from the peace he had once known. "I'll help you," Samuel said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But it will take time, and it won't be easy. These cabins aren't built quickly." The men nodded eagerly, and the deal was made. Over the next several weeks, Samuel worked tirelessly to teach them his methods, how to lay the foundation, how to construct the stone walls, and how to shape the roof so that it could withstand the elements. Yet, with each passing day, Samuel's frustration grew. The demands were constant, the expectations higher, and the solitude he once cherished felt like a distant memory. That evening, as he stood by his cabin, watching the last light of the sun slip behind the mountains, Samuel couldn't help but wonder, had he traded the peace of the mountains for something else? Was the price of innovation too high? Winter descended once again on the rugged peaks of the Rockies. the cold air biting deep into the flesh. The sky was a relentless gray, clouds hanging low over the snow-covered land. Samuel had long since grown accustomed to the harsh winters, but this year felt different. The weight of everything he had built, everything he had started, seemed heavier than before. He had worked alongside the Bitter Creek settlers, guiding them in building their cabins, showing them the finer details of his design. The cabins, now spreading across the valley, were stronger and more secure than anything that had come before them. But as the winter winds began to howl, a sense of unease crept into Samuel's heart. The more cabins that were built, the more he felt like a piece of his soul was being left behind in each one. What had once been a personal quest to survive had now turned into a movement, something bigger than he ever intended. One cold afternoon, as Samuel walked through the snowy woods near his cabin, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice calling out to him. He turned to see Elias Turner, an old friend from his trapping days, trudging toward him through the deep snow. Elias had been one of the first to hear about Samuel's cabin design, and though their paths had diverged in the years since, they had stayed in touch. "I heard what you've been doing, Samuel," Elias said, his voice heavy with the weight of concern. "I know you've helped a lot of people, but it seems like this whole thing is growing out of control. You're becoming more of a legend than a man. How do you feel about that?" Samuel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he gazed out over the mountain range. The answer wasn't simple. "I've always been about survival, Elias. I never meant for any of this to happen. I wanted to keep the cold out, to keep myself and my family safe. But now people are relying on me. It's not just about surviving anymore, it's about what I've created." Elias stepped closer, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You've built something incredible. Your cabins are changing lives, but don't lose yourself in the process. You can't save everyone. Not all of them will appreciate what you've done the way you want them to." The words resonated with Samuel, but they also brought a bitter truth to the surface. He had spent so many years trying to make the world a safer place for others that he had forgotten to protect the one thing he had always valued most, his own peace of mind. The people who had come to him for help were grateful, but they also placed a heavy burden on him, one that was growing with each passing season. As Elias left, Samuel returned to his cabin, his thoughts weighed down by the conversation. The growing legacy of his work was both a blessing and a curse. He had built something that could stand the test of time, but at what cost? He had solved one problem, only to find himself facing a new one. Would his legacy be one of success, or would it be marked by the toll it had taken on his spirit? Samuel stood in the silence of his cabin, looking out at the snow-covered land. The legacy he had built had changed the frontier, but he now understood that it would take more than just bricks and mortar to truly make a lasting difference. By the winter of 1847, Samuel Tarrant had become a known figure across the frontier. What had started as a solitary personal challenge had grown into something much larger. The cabins he had helped design were spreading throughout the region, and the settlers who relied on them for survival looked to him as a leader, a guide in an unforgiving land. However, the passage of time had a way of reminding Samuel that even the strongest structures, no matter how well crafted, were still vulnerable to the elements. This winter was harsher than most, the wind howling day and night, and the snow piling up with no sign of slowing. It was the kind of season that could break a man, but Samuel had learned long ago that the mountains didn't care about his struggles. They only cared about survival. His cabins, which had withstood so much already, would need to prove their worth once again. Samuel had been keeping busy with repairs and upgrades to his own cabin, reinforcing the roof and ensuring the stone walls were still holding firm against the weight of the snow. His mind, however, was distracted. The demands for his expertise were growing by the day, and he had less and less time for his own life. He found himself thinking about the past more often than he cared to admit, the days when it had just been him against the wilderness, when survival was simple and certain. Now survival was shared with others, and the weight of that responsibility was becoming harder to bear. One morning after a particularly fierce snowstorm, Samuel awoke to find his cabin surrounded by several inches of snow. As he dug his way to the door, he noticed something that filled him with dread. The weight of the snow on the roof was far more than it had ever been before. The design had worked for so many seasons, but the burden of the storm felt different. With the added pressure, the metal roof groaned under the strain. He spent the day assessing the cabin, making sure the snow hadn't caused any structural damage. He carefully examined the walls and roof, noting that the weight was starting to compromise the strength of the roof supports. It was a sobering realization. Even his design, which had proven so resilient, was vulnerable to the brutal force of nature. He knew he would need to make repairs before the storm worsened. That night, as the wind screamed through the trees, Samuel sat by the fire, contemplating the changes he had made to his life and the frontier. He had created something that had saved countless lives, but the test of time was not over. The storm, as fierce as it had been, would pass, but the seasons would continue to bring new challenges. His cabins had helped others survive, but could they stand up to everything nature had in store? He couldn't help but wonder if the time had come to innovate again. What more could be done to make the cabins even stronger, more resistant to the elements? But with each passing year, the task became harder. He was no longer building for himself. He was building for everyone else. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him with every passing day. In the months that followed, Samuel continued to reinforce the cabins he had built. The weight of the winter snow had taken its toll, but with time, effort, and careful planning, he had managed to keep the roofs intact. However, the storm's damage lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over his once unshakable confidence. For the first time since he had begun his work, Samuel began to question if his designs were truly enough. Were they the final solution, or had he reached the limits of what he could do with the materials at hand? One evening, as he made his way to the cabin of a nearby settler, his mind raced with questions. The man, Caleb Thomas, had been one of the first to build a cabin using Samuel's design. His cabin had withstood the harshest conditions, but the recent storm had left it needing repairs, just like all the others. Samuel had promised to help Caleb with the work, but as he walked through the snow, his thoughts kept returning to the same doubts. Had he done everything he could? Was this the best he could offer to the people who depended on him? As Samuel approached Caleb's cabin, he noticed the faint glow of a fire through the window. Inside, Caleb sat by the hearth, warming his hands. The cabin, though sturdy, looked worn from the battle against the winter. The roof, though reinforced, had taken on the stress of the season. "Evening, Caleb," Samuel said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "Evening, Samuel," Caleb replied, his face tired, but relieved to see the man who had helped him build his home. "I was just thinking about the storm last week. I didn't think we'd make it through." Samuel stepped inside, his boots heavy with snow, and took a moment to look around. Despite the wear on the structure, the warmth in the cabin was undeniable. The stone walls, though weathered, still held the heat from the fire. "You did well," Samuel said, sitting down beside Caleb. "The cabin held up better than I expected. We'll fix the roof, reinforce a few more places." Caleb nodded, but there was something in his eyes that Samuel couldn't ignore. It wasn't just relief. It was doubt. The same doubt that had been creeping into Samuel's mind over the past few weeks. Caleb was one of the first to adopt Samuel's design, but even he knew the risks involved. "I know it's not perfect," Caleb said, almost reading Samuel's thoughts, "but I don't know what else we could do. Without your design, I wouldn't have made it through this storm. Without your help, none of us would." Samuel sat silently, the fire crackling in the background. Caleb's words echoed in his mind. "Without your design, we wouldn't have made it." For the first time in years, Samuel felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, a sense of fear. Fear that perhaps in his drive to help others, he had overlooked something important. What if his design, as solid as it seemed, wasn't enough? What if there was something more he could do? The fear of failing those who had relied on him was an unsettling feeling, one he had never experienced before. As the night wore on, Samuel's doubts grew. The path he had chosen was not as clear as it once seemed. What would happen if the storm came again, fiercer than before? What would happen when the next generation of settlers looked to him for answers? Samuel couldn't provide an answer. The future was uncertain, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his legacy press down on him, heavy and unresolved. The following days were a blur for Samuel. As the cold winds swept across the mountains once more, he found himself lost in thought, wrestling with the doubts that had taken root in his mind. The winter had brought unexpected challenges, and while his cabins had survived, the strain of the storm had left him questioning his own ability to continue innovating. He had always prided himself on building something that could stand the test of time, but now he wondered if there was more to be done. It was during one of his late-night walks, when the moonlight cast long shadows across the snow, that the spark of a new idea struck him. He had been so focused on reinforcing the cabins, on ensuring they could endure each season, that he had never considered the possibility of changing the design itself. Perhaps it was time to push beyond what he knew. Samuel stood still, the biting wind stinging his face, as he visualized a new way forward. The stone walls, though sturdy, could still be made more resilient. The roof, though reinforced, could be altered to handle even greater pressures. And the door, he could make it even stronger, more impenetrable. Samuel knew the limitations of what he had built, but now he saw a future where those limitations didn't exist. The next morning Samuel returned to his cabin with renewed purpose. He set to work, revisiting the blueprints he had once sketched in his mind. He gathered new materials, stronger metal, denser stone, more durable wood, and began experimenting with new methods. His hands were rough and calloused, but his mind was sharp, eager to solve the puzzle that had been nagging at him for so long. For weeks, Samuel worked in solitude, his days filled with trial and error, testing each new approach against the unforgiving elements. Slowly, the cabin began to transform. He added reinforced stone foundations, integrated advanced roofing techniques, and redesigned the windows to be more airtight. Every improvement made the cabin stronger, more secure, and better equipped to face the brutal winters. Samuel's determination grew with every success, and for the first time in years, he felt confident that he was on the right path. His vision was no longer confined by the constraints of what had worked in the past. He had found a way to build a cabin that could endure anything the wilderness could throw at it, something truly lasting. It wasn't long before Samuel's new design was put to the test. The storm that had been brewing for days finally arrived, sweeping down from the northern peaks with a ferocity that made the previous winters seem tame by comparison. The wind howled as snow piled up in thick, relentless layers, and the temperature plummeted. Samuel knew this storm would be different, far stronger than any they had faced before. His first instinct was to check his own cabin. He hurried through the snow, his boots sinking deep into the powder as he made his way to the site of his latest creation. The new roof, the reinforced stone, and the new locking mechanisms, it had all been designed for moments like this. As he approached the cabin, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety mixed with anticipation. This was the moment that would determine whether his work had truly made a difference. Samuel entered the cabin, his heart pounding. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the stone walls. He checked the roof, the windows, and the door, all intact. The cabin was holding strong, and despite the brutal storm raging outside, it felt like a safe haven. For the first time in months, Samuel allowed himself a moment to relax. He had done it. The storm raged on for days, and Samuel stayed inside, keeping the fire burning, ensuring that everything remained secure. When the weather finally calmed, he ventured outside to check on the rest of the cabins in the area. What he found was a testament to the strength of his new design. The cabins, though battered by the storm, had held up better than anything built before. Samuel had created something that could withstand the worst nature had to offer. His work had proven itself, and as he stood in the quiet aftermath of the storm, he realized that his legacy was no longer just about surviving. It was about thriving, about changing the future of the frontier. The true test of his work had come, and Samuel had passed it. His cabin had endured. Now, more than ever, he knew that the future of the mountains was brighter, stronger, and safer than ever before. As the years went by, Samuel's life became a quiet reflection of the legacy he had created. His cabins, now scattered across the frontier, were still standing strong, a testament to his ingenuity and determination. He had become a figure of respect in the mountain communities, not for the fame he never sought, but for the safety and stability he had brought to so many. Yet Samuel still felt the pull of solitude, the quiet yearning for the days when the wilderness had been his only companion. The world had changed, and he had played a part in that change, but at times the weight of it all felt heavy on his shoulders. On the edge of winter, Samuel sat in his cabin, the fire crackling softly, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift down from the sky. The work was done now. His design had saved lives, changed the course of many futures. He had built more than just cabins, he had built a legacy. And in the quiet moments, as the world outside turned to winter, Samuel finally understood that his place in the mountains had been earned, not through his creations alone, but through his unwavering commitment to the land and those who called it home. By the time Samuel Tarrant passed, his name was etched in the stories of the frontier. His cabins, crafted with care and precision, had outlasted the test of time. Settlers continued to build using his methods, and his designs became a symbol of resilience in the harshest conditions. Samuel never sought recognition, but the impact of his work was undeniable. His cabin stood tall against the elements, shelters of strength in a wilderness that had once been unforgiving. The frontier had changed, but his legacy remained. And so, Samuel Tarrant's quiet life in the mountains, marked by a single, remarkable innovation, lived on. His work had been more than just survival. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest spark of necessity could create something that changed the world, one cabin at a time.